While the Vietnam War has been engraved into the American zeitgeist, the Korean War, for whatever reason, remains a largely forgotten event. Let's take a look at the events leading up to the Korean War and why America entered the fray. As a gateway to other countries and the Yellow Sea, the nations now known as North and South Korea were constantly bullied by larger countries, especially China and Japan. After the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan encroached on the Korean kingdom, known then as Joseon. After formally becoming a Japanese protectorate in 1905 and handing over control of administrative affairs to the Japanese in 1907, a treaty transferred the governance of Korea to the Emperor of Japan. Despite the Emperor's seal, the Koreans were treated as conquered people. The Japanese implemented their version of military rule, known as Budan Zaiji. But the Koreans, who had been used to self-rule within the Chinese orbit and were proud of their cultural traditions, were a cohesive social society. A resistance movement had been forming throughout the first decade of Japanese rule. On March 1, 1919, 33 activists publicly read a Korean Declaration of Independence in Seoul and aired their complaints on the radio and in the newspapers. The Japanese forces responded with violence and bloodshed. The Japanese occupation of the Korean peninsula created the perfect conditions for a resistance movement to grow. The Yongbon, educated civil servants and military officers, and the urban middle class resented the Japanese occupation and the lack of opportunities it offered. While a select few Korean elites were becoming wealthy through collaboration with the Japanese occupiers, the majority were made landless and reduced to a state of poverty by Japanese rule. The Korean nationalist movements continued to influence the landscape despite the aggressive assimilation policy of the Japanese. Several trends were operating from abroad and within the country: the student movement, the exiles in Soviet Russia, the exiles in China, the righteous army, the peasant movement, and the guerrilla operations in Manchuria. But there was no single banner to unite and rally a population. On August 15, 1945, the Second World War ended. Japan surrendered to Allied forces and ended its 35-year occupation of the Korean peninsula. The Japanese left a blatantly unequal and divided Korean population with almost no middle class. Roosevelt had been unsure of the capacity of the Koreans to govern themselves after decades under Japanese rule. Roosevelt had a post-war vision of a world regulated by the Big Four powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and Great Britain. This vein of thought prompted him to adopt the idea of a North Pacific Regional Council, which would administer Korea after the war. The failure of the Roosevelt administration to make headway on any practical implementation or negotiation for the governance of Korea meant that when he died, the U.S. was back to square one under the Truman administration. Within a week of taking office, Truman had abandoned Roosevelt's idea of a joint trusteeship and began searching for an alternative solution. 2 days after the first atomic bomb, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, much earlier than the U.S. planners predicted. The Red Army moved into North Korea to defeat the Japanese Kwantung Army defending the north of the peninsula. The Japanese asked for surrender terms on August 10th, the day after the U.S. dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. 250,000 Soviet troops, accompanied by 35,000 Soviet Koreans, had occupied several prominent cities in North Korea. The Japanese military had divided Korea into the north, defended by the Kwantung Army, and the south, which the Joseon Army defended. With the Kwantung Army defeated and the Soviets in control of the north of the peninsula, Washington was desperately trying to prevent the complete annexation of Korea by the Soviet Union. The Americans proposed the 38th parallel as the demarcation line to the Soviets, and surprisingly, Stalin accepted. The U.S. and its allies influenced the south, and the Soviets occupied the north. Korea was officially divided. When the U.S. forces arrived, they were shocked by the support for the radical left in the south. The U.S. military did not just have to contend with a left-leaning population. The arbitrary division of the peninsula along the 38th parallel had caused economic chaos as well. The heavy industries and plants which had transformed the Korean economy under the Japanese were now predominantly located in the north, under Soviet control. Running out of options and unable to effectively manage the confusion in which South Korea had descended, the U.S. submitted the Korean issue to the UN. In 1947, the UN General Assembly upheld Korea's claim to independence, and began preparing for an election to select an independent national legislative assembly. The Soviet Union refused to concede the North, and it became clear the elections in 1948 would be for a separate government to govern the South alone. As it became evident to the public that these elections would cement the division of the Korean peninsula, a series of protests erupted in Seoul and other major cities. Following the dynamic interactions of various political factions vying for power, Kim Il-sung emerged as the leader of the Workers' Party of North Korea. Kim was sworn in as premier of the newly formed Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK. The Soviet Union declared Kim's government the only lawful government on the peninsula shortly after. In December, the United Nations General Assembly responded by saying the Republic of Korea in the South was the only legal government of Korea. The Workers' Party of North Korea joined up with the Workers' Party of South Korea to establish the Workers' Party of Korea, heralding the success and popularity of Kim. To reunite the Korean kingdom, Kim rallied support from Mao Zedong. Despite being initially against the idea, Stalin manipulated Mao to corner China against the West. By isolating China from the West, he would have ensured Chinese subservience to Soviet political strategy. Witnessing the rising popularity of Kim in the North and South, and considering the chaotic aftermath of the South's elections, U.S. military observers were deployed to the 38th parallel. The situation escalated on both sides. But on June 25, 1950, North Korea's Korean People's Army charged at the 38th parallel, catching the U.S. observers by surprise. While the South later claimed to be just as astonished by the Norse military move, Syngman Rhee, the newly elected South Korean president, was most likely already preparing for a northern invasion of his own. In the days following the North Korean invasion, the situation in the Republic of Korea went from bad to outright chaotic. In the 5 days between crossing the 30th parallel and the arrival of the United States military to support the South Korean government, Syngman Rhee fled Seoul in his special train and moved the entire Republic of Korean Army, or ROKA, headquarters to the south of the city. In doing so, he panicked the civilian population in Seoul and left troops fighting north of Seoul without communicating with their superiors and the rest of the ROKA. The Korean People's Army, or KPA, had captured Seoul by June 28th. The Americans did not have troops stationed in the Republic of Korea before Truman decided to commit U.S. ground forces. His decision to commit ground troops to Korea represented a new stance toward the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb at a test site. It became even more imperative for Truman and subsequent administrations to avoid a direct conflict with the Soviet Union out of fear it would escalate into a nuclear conflict. Hence, the two superpowers fought their proxy wars far from their respective homes. The North Korean forces had made considerable headway, forcing their southern counterparts to retreat. By late July, 47,000 Americans were fighting alongside 45,000 South Koreans against just 70,000 North Koreans, but the retreat continued. The North Koreans had severely surpassed the expectations of the American forces. They were an effective fighting force, skilled in the art of guerrilla warfare, with women among their ranks and plenty of sympathizers in the South. For the first 2 or 3 weeks, the KPA forces pushed past southern lines, taking cities and forcing retreats from the U.S., UN, and Southern soldiers. The tide began to change in mid-July, but the KPA was able to edge out a victory. Soon after the defeat, British forces reinforced the UN troops in the South. The arrival of British soldiers helped tilt the war in favor of the South. After the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, which continued through August and half of September, the KPA was forced to retreat. By early October, UN forces had restored the 38th parallel divide and had succeeded in containing the spread of communism on the peninsula. The KPA retreat was a brilliant maneuver that pulled U.S. forces close to the Chinese border, where the Chinese employed defensive countermeasures against the incoming soldiers. The Chinese counteroffensive began in earnest on November 27, 1950. As planned, the American forces were thinly stretched across North Korea, and the brutal Chinese attack cut the Allied forces down. In one swoop, Chinese troops had eradicated U.S. forces from the north of the peninsula and retaken Seoul for the Korean Communists. Once again, the tide of the Korean War had shifted. After weeks of brutal fighting, American forces retook Seoul, and in the spring of 1951, the battle lines hardened and stabilized along similar lines to those that still scar the peninsula today. The next phase of the war began in June 1951. The Soviet Union representative to the UN submitted a proposal that ceasefire discussions between the parties involved in the Korean conflict should begin. Talks began on July 10th in the ancient Korean capital of Kaesong, in the south of the peninsula. With stable battlefield lines, neither side suffered a large-scale loss of life. The war could have ended in 1951 when positions around the 38th parallel were assumed, but it continued for another 2 years. The US, China, and North Korea negotiated an armistice agreement in 1953. A demarcation line along the 38th parallel was carved, and a buffer zone of 2.5 miles was installed to avoid any unforeseen escalations. An armistice had seemed inevitable for quite some time, but the South Korean premier, Syngman Rhee, refused to sign the agreement. Unfortunately, despite verbal agreements from all sides, no formal document was drawn up. Additionally, South Korea refused to participate in or acknowledge the ceasefire. So, technically, the Korean War is still happening. The Korean conflict claimed nearly 5 million casualties, with more than half being civilians. In the 20th century, only the First and Second World Wars claimed more lives than the Korean conflict. The Korean War forged the landscape of the Korean peninsula today and set the tone for how the US would deal with communist expansion across the globe. The war was of paramount importance to US policy throughout the 20th century. The loss of life across Korea was catastrophic. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the Korean War, check out our book, Korean War, A Captivating Guide to the Korean War History. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.